episode 3 of season 14 of Mention and Dispatches. We're well underway with our 14th season, so that that's our 7th year of doing this, or wrapping up our 7th-ish year of doing this, and that just means we're sort of nuts, is really what it means. Coming back to us tonight, Mike, this is 2 shows in a row. Appreciate you being here.
Yeah, so I've ruined my perfect attendance by missing the first episode, so that's already shot. But I'm 2-1.
Given that you were otherwise engaged the weekend of the AC/DC, and that was the topic of the opening episode this season, we could have invited you, but it wouldn't have done a whole lot of good.
It doesn't matter. I have a lot of sarcastic comments for many different situations. So this
is a fair point, and probably yet another good reason to not invite you to that. And then also back, this is like only maybe 1 season between appearances instead of his usual 4-season hiatus. But our buddy Sam is here with us again. Sam, how you doing, man?
I'm doing pretty good, thanks.
Cool. Appreciate you being here too, because Sam's going to end up taking the lead on a bunch of this, although Mike's got more experience in the area than I do. My love of historical 4X gaming is pretty well documented, both tabletop and digital. Vance is probably a better Civ player than I am, but I think I've got way more hours than him in the game. But then also tabletop 4X stuff, like I've been a fan of for a while. I don't generally do space stuff, which is why we bring in somebody like Sam to talk space stuff when we're going to do space 4X games for the podcast. But something we've not touched on in any of the 160 podcast episodes before this, so we've never really talked about the fantasy 4X genre, mostly on the computer, although there are some tabletop fantasy 4X games, and I've got 1 or 2 of those under my belt. So when we talk tabletop stuff, I'll actually have something to contribute besides asking questions. But the fantasy 4X space is not one that we tend to discuss very often, despite there being a lot of different games out there in that space and some love for it with the Dragoons. Now, Sam has never seemed to meet a 4X game genre that he wasn't willing to dive into and enjoy. So of course, Sam's got some 4X stuff under his belt. But Sam, before you run off with the rest of this episode, I do want to ask Mike, for fantasy 4X experiences, how much of what do you have under your belt, digital versus tabletop, and what are some of the things that you did and didn't enjoy about them?
So way more digital than tabletop. And actually, I started playing. I was always more sci-fi than fantasy. So I've got a lot of 4X sci-fi, 4X, like you said, historical type stuff under my belt. So, but I did play some 4X fantasy even back in the day. And the things I look for in fantasy 4X is the same thing as any 4X. I want the 4Xs, right? And where you're playing the tabletop games, I don't think you get all of those, at least not with a fantasy game that I can think of. I can't think of any fantasy game that's a tabletop game where you get the exploration part of that. Space Empires 4 gives you that. You're actually exploring hexes and seeing what's in them. Can't think of a fantasy game that does that. I'm not saying there is one, but I can't think of one right now.
The Mage Knight board game is the one that immediately comes to mind.
And I've never played that, so that's interesting.
Yeah. So there just for the audience's clarification, there is the Mage Knight collectible minis game from 25 years ago now. Fun game, not what we're talking about. I'm talking about the Mage Knight board game from Vaclav, what's his name? I can't think of his name off the top of my head. That actually is a very close procedural cousin to one of the Star Trek exploration board games. The underlying engine is very similar in the way you're unloading the tiles and facing the challenges as you're playing the game. But you do build the map as you go in that game, in that Mage Knight board game.
Sounds a bit like Star Trek Ascendancy. Is that the one you're referring to, Brant?
I think that's the problem is, so I'm not a Trek fan like you guys are. So I don't know. I know a bunch of the Star Trek titles, but I've not played any of the games to really know beyond that.
Sure.
So I'll take your word for it. If you say it sounds like Ascendancy, I will nod and agree.
So I actually owned the one you're talking about. It was Star Trek Frontiers, was the Star Trek version of Mage Knight.
Okay.
And I never played it and actually got rid of it at the last Armchair Dragoons convention.
Well, okay then. Clearly made a big impression on you.
I didn't make any impression. I never played it. It was just one of those things where I just knew I would never get around to it. And if I were going to play a Star Trek game, it was going to be Starfleet Battles, Federation and Empire, Federation Space, or something else.
Something of the classic Trek genre.
Yeah.
So, okay. No, that's, dude, I get it, man. I get it. So going back to you were talking that you weren't 100% sure of what there was for Tabletop Fantasy 4X, but you've done some of the digital ones.
I have done some digital ones, and the earliest one that I can remember, let's see if I can call this to my brain. It was by the company was called Strategic Studies Group, SSG, and they've done some more games. They did some more games. I think they did Panzer, and I think they did a Pacific game, but I only ever owned the one I'm about to mention, well, two, because they had a sequel, and it was a game called Warlords, and there was a sequel called Warlords 2, and that's the earliest one that I can remember playing on the computer, I think. No, I take that back. I'm forgetting about Master of Magic, right? Yeah, I think everybody played that one back in the day. So that was probably the first one I played.
All right.
But Warlords was definitely one of the early ones that I could remember.
Is there much you remember about the gameplay itself, or is anything in particular really stick out to you as, wow, this is really cool, or damn, this sucked?
It's so long ago, I just cannot remember much about it at all. I'd have to go look it up.
Yeah.
I remember I enjoyed playing it, but I don't really, it's been so long, I don't remember exactly what it even entailed. I seem to remember there were kingdoms and you were just trying to attack the other kingdoms. There may not have been much exploring in that one now that I think about it, but there could be. I don't know. I have to go back and check it out again. I know Master of Magic had exploration, right?
Yes.
So it definitely had all the 4Xs.
Yeah. And on the off chance it didn't, don't worry, Sam would correct you. It's interesting that you talk about how many of the 4Xs are actually present as you're playing, because I do think that while we want as many of them as possible to be present, because that's just sort of if you're playing a 4X game, you want the full meal deal there. But I think there's a variety of the tabletop games where losing the exploration element in a fantasy game doesn't necessarily detract from the game too terribly much. And you still get a pretty rich and meaningful gameplay out of it. And a couple of the examples I'm thinking, like Divine Right is really a 3X game, not so much a 4X game. I don't know how much sort of resource exploitation exists in something like Burning Banners. I think that's more of just a straight up war game with some fantasy elements to it.
There's a little bit, not much. I mean, like you can mine, I think, so you can get stuff.
So there is some.
I think there's a little. I don't think there's much at all, though.
Yeah.
It's not a capital X, it's a small X.
Yeah. I get it. One of the other ones that I've written about, republished a classic review of at the site, was Gamelin Games' Tiny Epic series. One of their first ones they did was Tiny Epic Kingdoms. And Tiny Epic Kingdoms definitely has 3 of the 4 X's in it. You're not exploring really because the map is built in front of you. Everybody has their little home card that they start on as you push the map tiles together. But it's got the other 3 to include the resource exploitation. I mean, that is a driving factor in that game, is gathering and using resources. The problem with Tiny Epic Kingdoms is that the combat is just so damn unsatisfying. It's almost a 2.5X game. And that was the really unfortunate part of that game.
Yeah. And before we get too far away, there's probably 1 or 2 people, maybe none, but there's probably a couple people wondering what the 4Xs are. And let's go ahead and tell them what those are. They were, it was a term that Alan Emmerich, the late, great Alan Emmerich, who recently passed, back in the early 90s, he came up with the 4X, and the 4Xs stand for, Sam, you want to do it, or do you want me to do it?
Go for it.
Explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. So those are the 4Xs that he came up with.
Wow. Which is where you come up with the Explorminate website that covers 4X gaming in great detail. We've mentioned a little bit of the stuff Mike has done. There's a little bit of tabletop stuff that I've done here and there. I've not done fantasy 4X stuff on the computer. First of all, ain't a whole lot of it even made for the Mac. But second of all, if I'm sitting down playing on the computer, I'm sticking with the Civ series, right? It's the stuff I love and know and prefer to do. Sam has never met a 4X game he wasn't willing to at least try. So Sam, rather than you sit here and spend 2.5 hours giving us the inventory of all the stuff that you've done over the years, is there a particular fantasy 4X game that really jumps out at you as being particularly fantastic or particularly awful? You don't feel bad about, crapping on a bad game here.
Well, my longtime favorite fantasy 4X, and I mean, Mike and quite a few of the guys in the forum certainly know this already, is Fallen Enchantress Legendary Heroes.
Okay.
Which is a sequel, standalone expansion, whatever you want to call it, to Elemental War of Magic by Stardock.
Okay. Just for the audience's sake, are those still in circulation, or are these something you've got to find on a back catalog somewhere?
That's what I was going to say is, when did Elemental first come out, Sam? It's been a while.
Elemental was released in 2010, and no, it is no longer available.
Yeah,
Stardock deliberately pulled that one because the launch, it did not go well.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
That good, huh?
So no, yeah, like I since I was one of the people that pre-ordered the game, I actually got Fallen Enchantress Legendary Heroes for free.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, I did too, actually.
Okay.
That was a really great thing of Stardock to do, Brad, to do that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's cool.
So yeah, I mean, that's been my longtime favorite. Now, more recently, in the last month or so, I started getting into Age of Wonders 4, which is a very different beast, but that one has also been proving to be a lot of fun as well.
Yeah, I would have to say, for me, if I had to pick an all-time favorite, it probably would be Age of Wonders 3. I never played the first two, but I really enjoyed Age of Wonders 3.
Okay, so before you get too far off on Age of Wonders, Sam, Fallen Enchantress, what is it about it that grabs your attention as much? Look, it's fantasy stuff, so it's clearly not fidelity to history or something like that. Is it the characters in the game? Is it the creatures and critters and such? Is it the combat system? Is it the magic system? What is it about that game that really grabs you and says, hey, come play me?
It's an aggregate of a number of things. For one, the exploration is quite fun. The exploration aspect is good. The maps are satisfyingly large if you want them to be. There's a good deal of customization. You can create your own ruler, sovereigns, they're called in the game. You can create your own factions, kingdoms, or empires. The combat is enjoyable without being overly long or complicated. I like how the lore and the story is. There's nothing, assuming that you're just playing a regular sandbox game and not one of the campaigns, or not playing any of the scenario games. The story and the lore, they're just woven into, like, just reading the text descriptions of locations, the units, the other sovereigns and champions you'll run into. It just hints at so much of the world's history. That's it's great for atmosphere and immersion, which that sort of thing just really sucks me in. And then the other thing that I feel it does really well is the city building. I mean, the way your cities, the first time they level up, you get to choose, just like with your characters, the first time they level up, you have to choose a class for them, a path. The first time your cities level up, you have to choose a path or a class for them. Do you want it to be a town that focuses on growth and wealth generation? Do you want it to be a conclave that focuses on research and mana generation? Do you want it to be a fortress that focuses on defense and producing stronger units for your armies? And the magic system is very solid, very fun, and it just combines all of those things into something that is much greater than the sum of its parts.
Cool. It's a solid look at that. You mentioned the sovereign creation, sort of building your own leader, and I'm assuming that's almost sort of a character generation kind of process. If we were playing out more of an RPG, what are the kinds of things that you can do with a sovereign? I'm assuming there's some sort of stats, but there's probably some level of skills or personality or other things that you can do with these things, with these guys.
Yep, exactly. You first you pick a nation that you pick a nation for your sovereign, either one of the kingdoms or one of the empires, or again, you can create your own. And then you choose a background, whether that's adventurer, mercenary, a former bandit, a scholar, and those will all grant your character different abilities and bonuses. You can choose what kind of magic, if any, to specialize in, what kind of, are there any special equipment or weapons that you want to outfit your character with. There's quite a few options for how you want to customize your sovereign.
Did you have a particular favorite that you lean towards pretty regularly?
I tend to gravitate towards the kingdoms, and I do like my mages that specialize in some school of magic or other. And the scholar background is good for the extra research and extra magic ability.
Okay. Mike, you'd mentioned having played that one some yourself as well. Is there a particular character or not character, but sovereign style or sovereign path that you prefer one way or the other?
Yeah, definitely. In these types of games, I always like to play like a wizard. I love the magic in these fantasy games. And so, as Sam is saying, you start your sovereign off as a mage or a wizard, and as the game goes along, you build up your spell book, and the sovereign can cast spells, and he can cast spells on your cities, or you can cast them in battle. He can actually travel around and fight battles if you want him to. And the other cool thing is he's not the only magic user out there. You can recruit other magic users and have them go out and fight battles, and use their magic. And I think, if I'm also not mistaken, you can get magical items, right, Sam? You can get
absolutely.
You get weapons that give you greater attacks or more damage, and protective items and potions and all kinds of cool things.
Yep, you can get them from fighting random monsters, from quests, especially quests. I love the quest system in that game. From clearing out the various wildlands that you come across. All sorts of different ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a little bit of role-playing element. You get the side quest, or you get the main quest. Of course, you get these other quests you can go out and do. You don't have to do them. I mean, it's your choice.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of cool.
Yeah. One of the things that obviously sort of sticks out in terms of one of the fantasy 4X games, Mike, you leaned right into it, and that is playing a wizard, playing a mage, playing somebody who's got this supernatural capability that isn't something that you see in any of the historical games, right? This is a fantasy game. And so having the ability to sort of, bend the rules of physics or whatever. I've seen discussions of, again, not played the digital fantasy 4X ones really, but I've seen some of the discussions that you guys have had around some of them that, we're researching particular spells. So I've got this spell for combat, or I've got this spell to, do something for my cities or my kingdom, my realm, my whatever. As we're talking the magical effects within a fantasy 4X game, what are some of those kinds of effects that you can bring to bear, and how do what are some of the ways that you can channel those to best effect as you're playing? And you don't have to lean on just the Fallen Enchantress game. Like, if there's other games that have a good example of this, Sam, take that and run with it, man.
I mean, Fallen Enchantress, to just start with, that is obviously a good example where, on the Empire side of the game, the strategic side, there's spells you can cast for boosting, the gold income of your city, or you can cast something on your city so that all units trained in that city receive a permanent bonus to their defense, their hit points, their attack, etc. In combat, to take Age of Wonders 4, for example, you can, there are numerous spells you could cast where, it's, you buff everyone within, a 1 hex radius around your leader, which those are very nice. I'm very fond of those kinds of spells. And of course, the ones that, do direct damage to enemies, where it just, you're essentially just hitting the smite button, if you will. Those are always fun.
Yeah. Mike, what about you? Anything in particular stick out about, the way in which you develop them, use them, whatever?
So, for me, it all these 4X games, even the ones outside of the fantasy 4X games, and you're playing something. I remember when I first played Civilization, just knowing that, you start off with your warrior, and just knowing that you could eventually have a jet fighter, or you could have, tanks. The drive to play the game and just to see what those things was so great that, you just wanted to keep playing it. So when you're playing a fantasy game like this, it's the same thing. You're trying to get your spells maximized so you can do all these neat things, and what you can do, like Sam said, there's just so many different things. You can make the lands fertile around one of your settlements if you go far enough, and there's all kind of crazy things you can do, but that it kind of keeps you involved in the game, right? I mean, customization for me is always the number one thing. I want to be able to customize my nation or my kingdom and my leader and those kinds of things. But the next big thing is the discovery and the getting to the more advanced things that are out there, and you want to try them out, right? Hey, how's that nuke going to look when I launch it against one of those cities over there? It sounds terrible, but it's fun to watch it happen, unless it happens to you first, which it has.
Yeah, Mike, have you do you know the joy and fun enchantress of casting volcano on an enemy city?
No, see, that's the problem, is I haven't gotten really very far in any of these fantasy 4X games, which is kind of sad.
So, hey, I do know that pain. So, Fallen Enchantress is admittedly one of the few where I have played far enough in where I researched those spells. I do love the ones that affect the actual land in the game where, you can raise a volcano anywhere, including in the middle of someone's town.
I will say that, not fantasy, but if I remember correctly, Alpha Centauri, which would be a 4X space game, it had the technology that would let you terraform, where you could raise land and you could lower land. And that was just really awesome, because eventually what happened in Alpha Centauri was you'd pollute the world so much that the sea levels would rise, right? So you had to start doing something about that, or your cities would sink into the water if you didn't have the right technologies to dome them or whatever. So yeah, I can imagine that would be really fun to get to the point where you're altering the landscape.
Oh yeah.
I mean, why not alter the landscape? What the heck? As when we're sort of fiddling with, one of the things that happens a lot with historical 4X games, Mike, you mentioned it, sort of that technological development as you go, that takes you from the warrior to the spearman to the swordsman to the heavy footman or whatever, the man at arms, and then you invent gunpowder, and so now you've got a musket man becomes a rifleman, becomes a whatever. That's based loosely on the technological developments, mainly of Western civilization, but not exclusively, of human history here on Earth. Clearly, those shackles are not binding what happens in a fantasy 4X game. But other than magical developments, I'm assuming there's some level of technological development as a part of the exploit and expand process in a fantasy 4X game. Mike, compare sort of the fantasy 4X to historical 4X there in the way technology works in one of those games.
It works the same way. I know Age of Wonders, I believe, is the one that has gunpowder technology. Isn't that right, Sam? You can actually get gunpowder units.
3 and 4 both do. Yes, I don't remember.
I've only really ever played 3, so I think you could. I don't know how far it went, but I know you could have Brant, more historical type technologies that you could advance with. But the progression for these fantasy games, there's still a technological progression. But it's interesting because when I play them, when I play the historical ones, and I've got the warrior and the first little boats you have, the triremes running around, you kind of know what you've got and you kind of know what's ahead. With the fantasy ones, it's a little different because, for instance, what game is it? It's either Age of Wonders or Fallen Enchantress, where when you start exploring, one of the first spells you can actually cast is you can create almost like a familiar. You summon they're not called familiars, Sam. What are they called? Basically, what you're doing is you're summoning either like a ghost or you're summoning a giant eagle, and you can take that thing. You create it with a spell, and you can send it out exploring, and it can go over land, water, or whatever. So you're exploring in the first couple of turns. You're already exploring overseas, where we're playing a historical game. You can't do that, right? You've got to wait till you get navigation, and you get the bigger ships where you can actually go out and see what's on the other side of the world. With these fantasy games, you're not limited by that. You can cast this giant bird creature, and he can go off and see what's on the other side of the world early in the game. So that's a difference.
Right.
But there's still a progression there. Like Sam says, you start off maybe casting fireballs in battle, but it sounds like you get later in the game and you're creating volcanoes or something.
You can, yes. Yep. Or so, you could even like possibly submerge someone's town if you do it right. I usually don't bother, but
unless they really, really make you mad.
So I get that Sam is sort of speaking from experience on this. I'm just questioning if he did it as the sinker or the sinky. So
I was just trying to see if I could, honestly. And they attacked me first anyway.
And just trying something to see if it works, that's a valid reason, right?
Exactly. It was for science.
Magical science.
Clearly, yeah. Look, there's some favorites we've got, some things we particularly enjoy doing with them. I am curious if there's one of the, again, mainly talking computer games at the moment, if one of them particularly jumps out as being graphically snazzier than the others. Is there one of them is like, oh my God, that game looks good, I don't care that it plays like crap. Or, oh my God, that game looks good, and that's one of the reasons I love it. Like, is there something in particular that sticks out around those?
The Age of Wonders games.
I would say this exactly the same thing. It's especially the fourth one, the newest one. It looks really good.
It does look really good. And that when it came out at the time, Age of Wonders 3 looks very good as well.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, Triumph Studios has always their Age of Wonders games have always looked good for the time. I remember even when I played the first Age of Wonders game, I think that came out back in 99, 2000, and that one looked good. Yeah.
And one thing about Age of Wonders, Brant, if you haven't played it, one of the interesting things about 3, and I'm assuming 4 is the same way, is you're playing on the surface, running around like a historical game where you're exploring the continent and all this stuff. You can actually go underground in Age of Wonders. There's an underground level that looks completely different than the above world looks, which is pretty cool, pretty snazzy.
Yep. Yeah, and in Age of Wonders 4, you can actually start underground if you want.
Yeah. I think you can in 3 too, or maybe not. Maybe that's not. I can't remember. It's been so long.
Same, sad to say. Can't remember either.
Clearly, y'all have something to get back to.
Yeah. Well, and then there's another game, Warlock, and there's Warlock 2, and not only I don't think they have an underground in that game, but what you can do is you can go to other planes. So you can have the fire plane or the earth plane, and there's like I don't know how many different planes you can go to that are completely different than the one you start on, which is also kind of cool.
Huh, okay.
Bob could tell us if he were here. I think he likes Warlock too.
Yes.
Bob is likely to be in bed at this point.
Yeah, well, let's hope he is. It's like 3:00 in the morning there, something crazy.
Yeah, no kidding. So,
but graphically though, I don't think these games, they're just not really, that graphics aren't the thing, at least not yet. I know the technology is advancing rapidly for what we can do with computers, and with AI coming on the scene, we may see some really crazy stuff happen. I don't know. Sam, is Stardock working on a Fallen Enchantress 2? Do we know?
Well, like I mentioned a few months back, Brad, there's been no official announcement, but Brad ever so casually dropped the info in the Explorminate Discord that Stardock is working on a remake/remaster of Elemental War of Magic combined with Fallen Enchantress Fallen Enchantress Legendary Heroes.
That's right. And I'm wondering, because Fallen Enchantress, while it's a great game, to me, it's kind of cartoony looking. So maybe that's one of the things I'll take a look at. Maybe it'll make it more, realistic looking or something.
Maybe.
And I would never let graphics stop me from playing one of these games.
Same. I mean, and I know I think I know where you're coming from that as far as like the visuals in Fallen Enchantress goes. They are an acquired taste. I remember not being wild about them when I first saw what the game looked like either, but they did grow on me over time.
Yeah, they're not horrible. They're definitely, usable. They're not bad.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're just the art style and the art design is definitely it's different from what you see in most other fantasy games.
Yeah, it's almost like a drawing or something. It's kind of interesting.
Yes, exactly. That's perfectly put.
Which, I think that's probably what they were going for. So, and that's the one I believe when you zoom out from, you zoom out to the strategic map, it kind of doesn't it convert into like an old style map?
Yep, transitions into a cloth style map. Exactly.
Yeah. So it looks like it's an old cloth. It's really, that part looks really cool to me, though. I have to say, when you zoom out and you have that cloth map and it's got the regions and it looks like some kind of Tolkien-esque thing. It's really cool.
Yeah. Well, and Age of Wonders 4 now does the same thing as well.
Yeah.
So
I need to play that one. It goes on my I need to play list of 1,000 different things.
Another one of your I didn't play any of this in my Steam library kind of games, huh?
Yeah.
That could be a whole episode in and of itself.
Our 14th season of Mentioned in Dispatches is made possible by all of our Patreon supporters, but especially our regimental patrons who supported us at the top level.
McKenna.
What?
Let's just do it normal, please.
There's no fun in that.
Our 14th season of Mentioned in Dispatches is made possible by all of our Patreon supporters, but especially our regimental patrons who supported us at the top level. Regiment of Strategy Gaming would like to thank Stagger Wing, Paul LaFontaine, Matthew Rowe, Joseph Knoll, Fred and our favourite podcast dog, Kevin Bertram, Catastrophe Games, Patrick Garrity, Michael Sunborg, Chet Bell and Andy J. Wargaming is our jam, and they help us spread it. You too can join the Armchair Dragoons as a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/armchairdragoons.
As you guys are describing some of the 4X series, I was trying to think of any digital games that I might have played that would fall into the realm of a fantasy 4X game. And the only thing that I can remotely come up with, I still don't think is a 4X. And that is, I've played, not lately, but I had played a bunch of the old Westnoth game over the years. The one that's kind of an open source.
Battle for Westnoth?
Yeah. And a bunch of the extended campaigns that you can get for that as well. And while there's a whole lot of exploring and a variety of expanding and exterminating, there's not really a lot of exploiting. You're not really building anything at a civilization level. It's a tactical skirmish level shootout with a little bit of resource spend to build your force going into the fight, but there's no real realm management to it at all. So I don't think I would classify that as any sort of a 4X anything. And I don't think I'd be alone in saying that doesn't really count as a 4X something. I think the only X that one really gives you is the exploring. Well, two of them is the exploring and the exterminating. But that's really all I can think of. But
well, people's definitions vary. I do know people who consider Battle for Westnoth a 4X. So
really, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Is there magic in that game?
Yeah. There is. There's not a ton, but it's there, and it's kind of hidden in the way it works within the combat system, but there's no real magic no real much anything outside the combat, just with the way the system's built. So it's a fun game. I just don't know. I don't know that I would put it into the 4X category. I would be curious, Sam, to hear some of the arguments of the people that might. And I'm not asking you to present those arguments on their behalf. I just, if any of these people are listening, pop into our forums and convince me otherwise. Mike, I wanted to go back to an area where you and I probably have a little more experience than Sam in terms of tabletop 4X stuff. You'd mentioned you weren't thinking of a whole lot of different options. The Mage Knight, when you're definitely building the map. The other one that I can think of, the original King of the Tabletop from Dragon Magazine 77. We've mentioned this a bunch over the years between some video discussions and some podcasts and such over the years that first of all, it's one of the best games, period, that Dragon Magazine ever put out. Did you ever play played that old King of the Tabletop game, the original one, way back when? All right. So I will try to do the brief summary here for the audience. You are 4 different rulers, up to 4 different rulers that each have your realm, and you're drawing some land tiles, but you're not truly building a map. You're just sort of taking control of certain land tiles, almost like playing land cards in Magic the Gathering, except that King of the Tabletop predates it by a decade. And based on the land that you have in your hand, you can try and recruit certain fantasy fighters into your army that correspond, the colors of the combatants correspond to the kind of land, whether it's a swamp or a forest or a desert or hills. Stop me if you've heard this before. So you're color coordinating the critters you can put on the map based on the land tiles that you have put down in front of you. Again, this predates Magic the Gathering by a decade. There is some exploitation where you can, build some mines or harvest some different resources that you are also using to build your castles, your towers, build up to your grand monument, which is the big uber castle that you're trying to build. There are varying paths to victory. You can just kill everybody else, or you can be the first one to complete your grand monument, or you can pile up a certain amount of gold. I want to say it was 100, but don't hold me to that. I don't remember. But there was a, gather enough loot victory condition in there as well. There were special characters that you could recruit, these different heroes you could recruit to your army. It was a 4X game in every way out there. The only thing it didn't do that a normal 4X game does was you didn't build a contiguous map. You still had areas of land that you were exploring and taking control of. You just weren't building it all contiguously on a map, and pretty much every player was adjacent somehow, based on the way the game laid out. Now, when King of the Tabletop got re-implemented as Kings and Things, which is one of the games I brought back on the Noble Knight trip, the map component of that did become an actual build it as you unfold it map, where you're putting hex tiles together to build the map over which you're fighting. And so at that point, geography matters, because whether or not you're contiguous to something or how far away things are now factor into the game that they didn't before in the older version of it. But King of the Tabletop was the first 4X game I'd ever played. Again, that was a couple of years before Alan Emmerich had coined the term, because he coined the term in the early 90s for the Master of Orion series, in a game review talking about them. But all of those features of a 4X were present in that old King of the Tabletop game, which is kind of cool. And it was definitely a fantasy game, right? You had walking trees, and you had flying griffins, and you had all sorts of different fantasy animals and critters and such. The forest, there was a whole tribe of different kinds of elves that you could recruit to do stuff. So it was definitely there. That was definitely a big component of it, and it was a realm building, realm management game, because you were trying to become the king of the tabletop. I would absolutely put that up there against whatever anybody else had. And even today, 40 years later, if somebody said, hey, let's sit down and play King of the Tabletop, I've got my full set of it built right here. Hell yeah, brother, let's sit down and play, because it was a fun game to play. I mean, we lost a whole lot of lunch hours in middle school to that game, let me tell you. And the PDFs are out there. Like, you can go get the PDFs and make your own version of this. And somebody's actually redone the artwork from the old Dragon magazine, which was basic two-tone artwork. It was black lines on different color cardstock tiles, depending on which land they were color coded to. But it was pretty basic artwork, and somebody's gone back, in the years since. I think you can pull it off of BGG as a free download, that they've redone a bunch of the artwork to make it full color and a little snazzier. So I enjoyed the hell out of that game, and I definitely would put it in that 4X category for a tabletop game. Beyond that, like, the tabletop 4X stuff that I've played has largely been historical things, right? I've got 1 or 2 of the Civilization games. I've got Historia. I've got Imperial Settlers. I've got, a bunch of those tabletop 4X kinds of things. Just they don't cross over to the fantasy realm really at all. Let's go. Mike, if you were looking to try and build a perfect fantasy 4X game, what are the top 2, 3, 4 things that you would absolutely want to make sure were in there, even if you're just sort of cobbling together a bit of a Frankenstein monster of here are some of the greatest hits from other games that I would want to make sure are all there?
Well, I mean, I've kind of already touched on it where I've got to have the customization, right? I've got to be able to name my nation, pick my flag or pick my symbol or whatever, and name it, name my leader. So that's huge for me. And that's true of any game, not just a fantasy game. That's it. Any 4X game, I'm going to want to do that. So I think I have to have that. And I have to have the exploration piece too, right? I don't want to see the map. I want to actually go out and discover it. And I've got to have a magic system. That's got to be in there. If you're playing a fantasy game, there better be a magic system. I don't mind if you have gunpowder units. That's okay. But there better be magic in my fantasy game. Gosh, I'm kind of on the spot here though, just trying to think.
Oh yeah, because I tend to do that to people on the podcast.
And then you know the creatures you encounter, right? You got to have the classic fantasy creatures in there. You want to see a dragon or two, and you want to see orcs and those kinds of things.
Sam, you know this is coming to you next, so be thinking about it now. So when we get to you, you don't give me a bunch of ums I got to edit out later,
or just throw it in now because I'm starting to go
I already know my answers, so I'm ready.
All right. What do you got then?
Well, one for sure is Mike's, the customization, and again that goes for any 4X game. Another one is also definitely got to have magic. I know there's a few fantasy games out there that are just like lower or almost pretty much no magic, and that's like, well, what's the point? The other is, or the next big one for me, and I've talked about this quite a bit in the forums, is it's got to have some genuine civ building elements to it. Okay. Like Age of Wonders 4, it's a fun game, but it's definitely oriented more about battles and combat and killing the enemy and gaining loot and whatnot, which of course is fun, but it does get to be a little old after a while. I like to still build an actual kingdom, an actual realm in the world. And then the last big thing for me is some sort of theme, establishment of lore or history, some sense of the world that you're in.
Okay.
So Sam, do you have to have a campaign with your game, or is that optional?
No, campaigns are nice, but I have never needed them.
Me either. It's not something, I can't think of a single computer game I've ever played where I've followed the campaign. If I've had a choice to go sandbox, I always go sandbox.
Yeah. There's a few 4X games where I've dabbled in. I've played around with the campaign a little bit, or maybe there's or scenarios that come included, but never much. It's the sandbox is always where the meat is at.
Which there you go, Brant. There's another big one I got to have, a sandbox.
No playing a scenario on rails, huh?
Yeah.
No. Sorry, Mike. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say. So I'll throw out a question since Brant's thrown out so many, and I'll even start first. But the question is: in these 4X games, has there been anything that surprised you as far as how maybe the 4Xs are conducted? And so while you're thinking about that, for me, and I've played a lot of 4X games or 4X fantasy games. Maybe not to the end, but I've played a lot of 4X fantasy games. But one that really surprised me and I thought was really cool was one called Edor. And there's 3 of these games, I think, that have been released. Can I name them? There's Edor, Imperium, Masters of the Broken World, although some would say Masters of the Broken Game, I'm sure. And I think the other one's Genesis.
Yep. Genesis was the first one, then Masters of the Broken World, and Imperium is the most recent.
And I think these get varying ratings as to how good or bad they are based on, some people say they're buggy, others say they're not. But anyway, the thing that I really liked in the game, and I think it's in all 3 of these, I'm not sure, but it really surprised me was, you start off, it's almost like what we would call, instead of having hexes, we have areas, right? So it's area movement, not movement, but it's, I think they're called provinces in the game. So you have a province, and when you start off, the province you start in even maybe 20% explored. So you're starting off playing with the area where your city or your settlement's located with the borders. You only know 20% of what's in that area. And then you have all these other provinces around you. And as you go out and explore, you're not only exploring outward, but you're kind of drilling down into your own province and the one next to you and the next to that, where you're trying to go from that 20% explored to get it up to 100% explored. And as you're doing it, you discover things. So there's almost like this 3-dimensional exploration phase thing going on where you're going across the map, but you're also drilling down into your own province to look around and see, hey, what's in these woods? What's in the mountains here? And so there's really a lot of exploring in those games. And I just really thought that was a really neat way to do it.
I really ain't got much for you there, just because, again, as you're talking digital stuff, it's not something I've done a whole lot of that I'd be jumping all over to say, yeah, you got to have this. I do think this is something that I would carry over a little bit from the historical ones, where your exploration and many of the ones that I've played, right, the Civ series, where it's literally the entire globe and you're zoomed so far out that it's just sort of, hey, you encountered a friendly tribe on occasion. I would want a little more dedicated time and energy and effort focused to not just uncovering the map, but Mike, to similar to what you were saying about you've got this province but only starts out partially explored. I like the idea of having to spend a little more time in the tile, not just uncovering it to go, oh, there's some hills. Like, what's in the hills? You know, a lot of the historical 4X games, just you automatically get knowledge of what resources in the hills, instead of having to spend some time exploring the hills and figuring out what's in the hills. And is there something useful in the hills? Oh, hey, it's not just a tribe, but it's a tribe I have to engage with in a certain way in order to make them friendly or hostile or whatever it may be. I do think there's some room for improvement there in any of the 4X games. Again, I'm speaking mainly from the historical, but I think even some of the fantasy ones would benefit from, you don't just automatically know everything about a space because you walk through it. You gotta spend a little time there.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a space 4X that does that, and it's Interstellar Space Genesis, where the adjacent sector, you know, you can explore it more than once. So you may find something that there's actually a planet here I didn't know was right there, which is kind of cool, right? So it's just really neat to me to have to, you know, like you said, Brant, you walk into this hex and you're like, God, you know, everything that's in this 100 miles square, whatever it is, you don't really know. You have to kind of spend time in that area, just seeing what's there.
Yeah. That's just something that I would think off the top of my head is a place where some improvement could happen. Sam, over to you.
Now this time I'm the one that's kind of stuck for an answer.
Way to go, Mike. Way to just grind it all to a halt with a stump the chump question there.
That's why I'm here.
So, I mean, that is something. I mean, that is something that afflicts just about all 4X games, of course, and it also just, you know, it's adjacent to a larger issue, which is that at some point the exploration aspect ends, when really, why would or should it? You know, even on our own planet, where technically everything has been quote unquote explored, there's still so much left to discover, and is still being discovered every single day.
Yeah. Oh, there's a reason I'm addicted to those BBC nature shows, right? I mean,
right.
There's plenty there to still explore.
Yeah. So. Yeah, it would be genuinely great to see more 4Xs. Like, to take another example, Stellaris does this to some extent, where, say, after you've colonized a planet, you know, even though your science ship came through and did a fairly thorough survey of the system and all the planetary bodies in it, you know, like, let's say you colonize, you know, and let's say you colonized the one inhabitable planet in that system. Well, after a certain amount of time passes, you might get notified that, oh, hey, we found an archaeological site here, or hey, we discovered that there's more mineral richness here than we initially thought. And so now you can build more mining districts than you originally could, or your mining output from your existing mining districts has increased. That sort of thing. So it would be great to see fantasy 4X games do the same thing. And I mean, 4X games just across the board.
Yeah, I think Civilization, one of the early versions of Civilization, you had your resources, you could actually use them up, and they would become depleted, and you would lose them. And then you also, if I remember correctly, they would also reappear sometimes. So you could, an oil source, you might have tapped the oil out and it disappeared, but then another one reappeared somewhere else that you could discover.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I'm imagining that second part, but I do know that resources could disappear. But I like the idea of, rediscovering these things, like, or as you discover technology, you're like, oh, wait, that yellow powdery material that I found in that one province is actually some element I need to cast this spell. I need to go back there and exploit it.
Yeah.
So that would be kind of cool.
Huh. I want to close on this, just kind of wrapping some things up for the audience. A lot of folks either sort of fall into the historical or the space 4X category, and we've talked about both a bunch over the years on the podcast, and we will yet again in the future, I'm sure. As somebody's looking at the fantasy 4X genre, and somebody might be interested in, hey, I want to go give one. This sounds like a cool genre, sounds like something I'd be interested in. Let me go give it a whirl. In terms of a good starting point, a good entry level one that's not going to overwhelm the player with too much to do, but still give them a good feel for a fantasy 4X type of game. Is there a particular starting point you would recommend? And then, maybe a little bit about why that starting point. Sam, you've got a lot of experience with these games. You've poked around at a whole lot of them over the years. Is there something that sticks out as, hey, this is a good place to start if it's something you're interested in?
Well, for Fantasy 4X, I mean, Age of Wonders 4 honestly would be probably a pretty good one. It's not terribly deep or complex. It's just kind of a good fun time where you're going and taking your new nation on an adventure through a classic fantasy world. You can make it more complex if you want to, but it really doesn't have to be, and it normally isn't. The next one might be a little bit more controversial, but the Master of Magic remake, I think, could be a good one.
Okay.
I know that one's a little bit more hit and miss among people, especially fans of the original, which is understandable. But in terms of how easy it is to pick up and play, it's fairly straightforward.
Yeah. Mike, what about you? Is there one that sort of jumps out that you say sort of, hey, this is what I'd want to do?
I've never put a ton of thought into this, but it's kind of like with the historical board game. When you ask somebody what era do you like to play? Do you like Civil War? Do you want to play Ancients? So I would approach it from that same point of view, and I would ask, what is it about fantasy that you like? And if somebody told me they like going out and finding a dungeon and exploring it, then I might say, well, look at Deity Empires, because there it's like Master of Magic, but you can actually go out into a dungeon and you can go down and explore the dungeon. There's dungeons in this world, and it's not a very hard game to learn. Another game I would recommend is Warlock 2, because if you played Civilization, you kind of know what's going on. It's not a very complicated game. It's fairly easy to jump into and start playing, and it has all of the things we've talked about, the exploring and the magic and combat and all that kind of stuff. So I would think either one of those two. And like Sam said, Age of Wonders is a great starting point. So any of those three. I
was going to ask you about Warlock, Mike. It seems like it'd be an easy one to learn. I just haven't spent enough time with him to know, sadly. So
and
I know Bob keeps telling me about it, and Metal Dog to some extent keeps telling me that I need to get into them, but.
Yeah, that I was going to say that it's like every other podcast. There's so many other fantasy games, fantasy 4X games that we haven't even mentioned. So
yeah,
you could probably do another show on this at some point.
Right.
Yeah, well, but I mean, it's one thing to just sit there and just rattle off an inventory of games. It's another thing to like tell people something about them, about this is why this one sticks out to me as being memorable, or this is why you should avoid this other one, or this one has a unique feature that others don't. I mean,
I agree. And that's what I'm saying. Because one thing that popped into my head was, I don't know if Sam's ever played this one or heard of it, but kind of along the lines of Fallen Enchantress, there was a game that came out, I think it was Planar Conquest, it was called, and
Own It.
I'm sorry?
Own It. I was actually Kickstarter backer for that one.
And that was the first one, right? And they kind of came back and redid it as Worlds of Magic.
Worlds of Magic was the original version. Planar Conquest was the...
Okay, so I got it backwards. But what I was going to say, Brant, is the thing about that is it's based on the 3.5 rule set from D&D.
Okay.
So there's something unique about that. If you like to play D&D and you're familiar with that rule set, go check out that game. There's just so many other games we didn't talk about that we could, and not just listing them, but just, little differences in them from what we've talked about already.
Yeah, no, that's why we do the podcast here. That's why we have these conversations is, what is it that someone should, could or should or ought to want to do about any of them. So that's why we're here.
Why? Are they broken?
Guys, I appreciate us having this discussion tonight. I hope we've given the audience a little bit of an insight into an area of 4X games that we don't talk about very much. And even on our site, the section on 4X games is largely space 4X stuff. The next most represented is the historical 4X space, even though there's probably a comparable number to the space 4X games. We have our couple of historical 4X ones we love and we stick to them. But fantasy 4X ones don't get talked about a whole lot. And maybe it's just the personal tastes of the people that are in the forums talking about these things. Maybe they're just not as good as some of the others that we'd rather be futzing around with. But as folks are interested in looking for a fantasy 4X something to check out, man, come on down. Come have a conversation in the forums. Ask some folks if they got a recommendation one way or the other, and see what they think. So, parting shot, Mike, anything in particular you can think of that we didn't discuss that we ought to?
No, but like you said, if someone's out there listening to this and we've missed your favorite game, or there's something we didn't talk about you want to hear more about, go to the forum and let us know. And in a future show, we'd be more than happy to maybe address some of those things. Let us definitely give us feedback. We use it.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even. We're not even the experts. I still consider that to be Bob.
We're a historical board game site mostly, but we've got a great 4X discussion going on the forum. And there's, like Brant said, you're going to find space, you're going to find fantasy, you're going to find anything with 4X, you're going to find it in there. And there's usually a group of people willing to discuss the games and engage. So come visit.
Yeah. No, that's totally fine. Guys, I appreciate the time. Audience, definitely appreciate the time. Glad you were able to join us for this discussion of Fantasy 4X games. As Mike mentioned, drop your thoughts and comments either in the forums or even just comment directly on the podcast page over on our site, and that's fine also. We're just barely getting into season 14 here. We've got plenty more to go. I am going back to Gamma Expo, so we'll get some stuff like air quotes around live, but I will do similar to what I did last year, where I talk to a whole bunch of different people and then piece it together afterwards into a single podcast episode. One of the things we're going to do this season that's a little different than other seasons is we're going to spend a little bit of time doing a bit of a deep dive into some particular game series. So we're going to talk about the Total War series of games in greater detail later this season. And we're also going to take some time to do a deep dive into the OCS series, the Operational Combat System from MMP. And we're going to spend a little bit of time doing a deeper dive into the Battles of the American Revolution series. So we're going to have some deeper conversations on those later this season as well. Mike, thanks for being here. Sam, thanks for being here. And audience, thanks for being here. We'll catch you next time on another episode of Mentioned Dispatches.